Power was far from scarce at Marineford. Everyone had it, in different forms, for different reasons. Some were born into it, some earned it through blood, and others even had it handed down like a title. However, the battlefield doesn't care about status or glory. All it cares about is strength. So who was the strongest man there? Was it Whitebeard, body failing, will unshaken, splitting the sea with his bare hands? Was it Akainu, who took the fury head on and kept moving forward like justice itself couldn't be stopped? Or maybe it was Mihawk, the calm in the storm, a man so sharp even the war didn't dull him. And finally, there's Shanks, who showed up late and still made everyone stop. All of these men have moments, feats, presence, and legacies that can make a case for them being the strongest on the battlefield. But in a war where monsters clashed and legends were tested, only one can stand at the top as the strongest. Which is why in today's video, we'll find out exactly who that was. When it comes to the discussion around who the strongest man at Marineford was, I want to make it clear that while there are several characters who could be argued to be the strongest at the time, when it comes to who I'm going to say is the strongest, I'll be going through and ranking them by who has the least best argument to who has the best argument. And when it comes to the character who I think has the worst argument despite being in contention for the strongest, it'll definitely have to be Akainu. Now, I only say this because people in general somehow think the Admirals are still the strongest people in the entire series. And then seeing as how Akainu is basically the strongest Admiral, this would basically extend to him being the strongest. With Admiral fans supporting evidence for this pretty much being that nobody in Admiral has faced throughout the series, including Whitebeard or Luffy, were able to leave permanent damage or scars on the Admirals. While when Aokiji and Akainu were fighting, they both inflicted permanent scars on each other, which is pretty much just an indicator of them having greater AP. Combine this with the fact that the Admirals were pretty much verbatim stated to be holding back in Marineford as to not cause an insane amount of damage, and people just think it's set in stone that the Admirals were holding back in Marineford, and in most instances where they have to fight, and if they were able to go all out, they would show that they're actually the strongest in the entire verse. Now, do I necessarily agree with this? Not really. Because either way you look at it, despite Whitebeard not being able to mortally wound Akainu or leave permanent scars like Aokiji did, at the end of the day, a 70-year-old dying man was still able to TKO Akainu and leave him out of the fight, and could have potentially killed him if he didn't think Akainu was falling down through a chasm to die. I think that pretty much knocks him and the other Admirals out of contention for being the strongest if he kind of outright lost to Whitebeard. Now, I know a lot of you Admiral fanboys are going to try to cope about this by saying that the only reason that Akainu was hurt by Whitebeard is because Whitebeard snuck him. However, I really don't see why people think this is a good argument, because it seems like in the anime community, there's some misconception that characters' durability and physiology can just change when they drop their guard. And I think this misconception mainly stems from the Dragon Ball community and Dragon Ball power scaling, since in that verse, that's basically the truth. You know what I mean? Because they have ki, if they're not amping their bodies with ki, when they're off guard and being humans, they're just naturally less durable. When it comes to One Piece, though, there's no in-universe explanation that tells us characters' durability magically drops when they're not paying attention to something. In fact, like the opposite is pretty much implied through characters like Kaido, basically like destroying things that make contact with them that aren't durable enough to hurt him. So I don't know why Admiral fans are so quick to make this argument that Akainu just magically turned into jelly when Whitebeard hit him off guard. Not only that, even if you think the first hit was off guard and that Akainu's durability was lowered, or that Whitebeard isn't fast enough to hit him on guard, then that's just completely not true, since with the second quick attack, Akainu was completely on guard and saw what was coming but was unable to get out of the way. So I really don't understand where Admiral or Akainu fans are coming from when they act like that one hit was the sole contributor to Akainu being on the ground unable to move. So all in all, while I think Akainu has some incredible feats in the war and is essentially the champion of the Marines, alongside arguably having the greatest AP in the verse, at the end of the day, due to him basically losing to an old sick Whitebeard, I pretty much think that anyone calling him the strongest is either like fully driven by agenda or just don't know what they're reading. Speaking of Whitebeard though, I think it's finally time to talk about why the world's strongest pirate should be in contention for being the strongest man at Marineford. And honestly, the argument is pretty straightforward. Whitebeard is stated to be the strongest man and pirate in the world on a battlefield full of men and pirates. And although a bunch of retards are gonna try to discredit him by being like, oh, it's reputation based, Kaido's stronger, Admiral's stronger, this was never proven at any point in the series, and just because you don't agree with a statement doesn't necessarily make it wrong. In fact, Oda actively shows us that Whitebeard's titles are not reputation based in real time based on his performance at Marineford. In fact, we see him pulling off insane feats like being able to heavily injure and TKO an Admiral, while characters like Garp and Luffy aren't able to do the same, with Gear 5 Luffy scaling directly to Kaido. And these are feats that were performed while Whitebeard was sick, dying, and off his medication. As Whitebeard on his meds is able to conquer his clash with Shanks, who is not only a rival to the world's strongest swordsman, but is basically just being set up to be the next Pirate King / Roger type of character. Now, despite me mentioning all this shit about how Whitebeard is the strongest, he's actually not the strongest. And I only say this because the term strongest can be interpreted in multiple ways. Because while you could argue that Whitebeard is the physically strongest and most powerful pirate when sustained on his meds, the fact of the matter is that he's not in his prime and he has to fight without meds. This basically just means that even characters who are weaker than Whitebeard technically, like Akainu, can still outlast him despite being beat up by him. So while Whitebeard had the best strength displays at Marineford, there are several characters who are relative to him before and after the war who have none of his health concerns. Therefore, while Whitebeard was ultimately the strongest man at Marineford, due to his health, he wasn't the strongest combatant. While on the topic of Whitebeard and his relativity to other characters though, I think it's a good time to transition into Garp and Sengoku's argument for being the strongest men at Marineford. And I'm not going to hold you guys, the whole argument for these two being the strongest pretty much revolves around them being rivals to Whitebeard in his prime and not having any of the same health concerns that he has. That and the fact that Garp was performing extremely well against Aokiji on Pirate Island. Since whether you like it or not, it's pretty arguable that Garp was beating Aokiji, and the only reason that he would have lost is because Shiryu stabbed him and caught him off guard. But even then, Garp was able to match Aokiji despite being verbatim weakened. On top of that, pre-time skip Sengoku was literally B Fleet Admiral. The Fleet Admiral being stated above the Admirals in terms of battle power and charisma, making it pretty safe to say that both Garp and Sengoku are on a similar level to Whitebeard, which is above the Admirals. And honestly, it's really not an argument since, like I mentioned earlier, Garp and Sengoku are pretty much just implied to be rivals to Whitebeard, or literally just, stated to be rivals, considering Garp used to have death battles with Roger all the time, and then Roger was also a rival to Whitebeard, and then Sengoku is just a rival to Garp, so it's just like a rival square. That said, even though Garp and Sengoku have this legendary power, at the end of the day, I think them being old men just holds them back severely, since even if they can output power above that of the new generation's strongest, as soon as they suffer a mortal injury like Garp did, or like Whitebeard did, they suddenly start to decline rapidly in terms of power, which basically just means that their old bodies aren't built for the attrition of war. With this narrative pretty much being proven by our next strongest combatant, Blackbeard. The only reason I say this is because we literally see Blackbeard and Sengoku fighting in Marineford, with Sengoku potentially being aided by Garp. I say potentially because during the events of Marineford in the manga, Sengoku and Blackbeard's whole fight takes place off screen, and we don't really know what happened. We just know that Sengoku was fighting with Garp by his side. So basically, Sengoku, with the aid of Garp, was still not able to beat Blackbeard, despite them both having no reason to be holding back and every reason for wanting Teach to be defeated. Not only that, but by the end of Marineford, Sengoku needed to be bandaged up heavily, and Blackbeard was on his way attacking Impel Down right after the war. So you can see who took more damage and who came out of that fight better. Also, during Blackbeard's invasion of Amazon Lily after his confrontation with Rayleigh, Rayleigh just basically admits that due to his age, he couldn't stand up against Blackbeard, which is just even more consistency for the narrative that despite these old characters still being insanely strong, any character relative to them that are in their prime age should pretty much just be able to beat them. And that's without even mentioning Blackbeard's second fruit, which besides for the characters above him in Garp basically makes him invincible against Devil Fruit users, as not only is he stronger than them or as strong as them, but he can also just negate their powers which carry heavily, especially in the case of the admirals and most of the warlords. However, Blackbeard can't turn off your powers if you don't have a Devil Fruit and rely on Haki, which is why the character above him is Shanks. The reason Shanks is above Blackbeard is because while Blackbeard has the strength of Whitebeard's fruit, Shanks was able to clash with Whitebeard while he was sustained on his meds and using Conqueror's Haki, which should scale above his fruit powers. Not only that, but in several data books it's basically just stated that Shanks was able to hold his own against Whitebeard and is a similar presence to him, which is an implication for him being on par with Whitebeard, which makes sense considering he's essentially the new age Roger and is about 90% of him, if not as strong as Roger in his prime. And this is far from inconsistent when you consider feats like Shanks being able to arguably perception blitz and stop Akainu in his tracks without even using Conqueror's Haki, him perception blitzing and blocking all of Kizaru's lasers in Film Red, and him literally Haki diffing Green Bull in Wano. So while I think that Shanks versus Blackbeard should be a high difficulty fight no matter what, I think that Shanks just has the slight edge in terms of abilities due to being a hard counter to Teach. Also, for some narrative glaze, this isn't necessarily power scaling. He was able to intercept Kaido and stop him from coming from Marineford, which is crazy aura, and then he was also able to end the entire war. So, yeah. In terms of narrative and aura, Shanks is fucking flexing and was definitely like the MVP of Marineford and would arguably be the strongest if it wasn't for Mihawk. But since there's a million Mihawk versus Shanks videos on YouTube, I'm just going to let Payne explain this one.
Now that I have you captured 9 tails, it's time to tell you the truth. Shanks has one tapped kid in the recent One Piece chapter, and I know you're a big red hair Shanks fan, likely on account of your Uzumaki genes. You might ask why I have you restrained to give you this information. It's because unfortunately for you, Shanks defeated Kid with a flying slash. In other words, a sword technique. And like me and the rest of the Akatsuki have been telling you, this is simply more evidence that he is a swordsman. Which of course means he is Mihawk's inferior.
Shanks is a hockey man.
A hockey man? You mean a fighter who relies on hockey? Like everyone else in the New World?
Well, it's different with Shanks. He's a hockey specialist.
There is no such thing as a fucking hockey man. That is just a cope by people with agendas. But with my Rinnegan, I can see past agendas, and the only eye superior to a Rinnegan is a Hawkeye.
Well, Shanks is Luffy's end goal. It makes no sense for him to be weaker than Zoro's end goal. That's basic narrative.
No, Shanks is not Luffy's end goal. Luffy's goal is the Pirate King. Shanks is simply a stepping stone, a competitor. Both Zoro and Luffy will be stronger than Mihawk at the end of the series, so I don't know why you seem to think this is a good argument. Anything else? Do you think Shanks might pull out a Haki Susanoo? Maybe a Haki domain expansion?
I have nothing to say to you.
I doubt it.